Welcome to the Pernicious Chattel channel. This is part 7 of my in-depth series examining Bob Black's 1985 essay, The Abolition of Work. The series playlist is linked above. In this section, now well into the last part of the essay, Bob is quite focused on outlining what he believes a post-work world would look like. Unfortunately for me, Bob has decided to include some more obscure references, and as a result, the script was a real challenge to write. Nonetheless, I found it fun, enlightening, and maybe I have a few criticisms. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Quote, "Next we can take a meat cleaver to production work itself. No more war production, nuclear power, junk food, feminine hygiene deodorant, and above all, no more auto industry to speak of. An occasional Stanley Steamer or Model T might be all right, but the autoeroticism on which such pest holes as Detroit and Los Angeles depend is out of the question. Already, without even trying, we've virtually solved the energy crisis, the environmental crisis, and assorted other insoluble social problems." Close quote. Bob is making a pretty solid argument here. In fact, to steal a phrase more often associated with simple-minded conservatism, he's applying good old common sense. The current economic system is geared exclusively to constant growth. That means ever-increasing amounts of production and consumption. Our wants are artificially created. They are not needs, nor would they be missed once people are free from constant commercial brainwashing. We live on a finite planet. So to continue on this almost exponential and infinite production consumption curve is complete insanity. Without becoming a space-dwelling species, a development impossible to our present or near future capabilities, we simply cannot continue to pollute and consume without environmental collapse and disastrous shortage. It is a mathematical fact. Technical advancement allows us to continue expanding for the time being, but we are progressing well behind the curve of solving our existential problems. We have no choice but to de-escalate our production and consumption in the near term, and this negative economic growth will be a central part of the solution to our problems. However, I will moderate my approval for this excerpt. Bob is implying with the sentence about Stanley Steamers or Model Ts that we should both reverse growth and reverse our use of technology. Here I'm pretty firmly agnostic. For the sake of argument, you could posit that humans are a technological species. It is a feature of our species that may be instinctual. So to suppress our ability to innovate without a solid justification is not something I would sign on to. Should we produce less? Absolutely. Should we be more cautious in our use of technology? Again, absolutely. Should we stop looking for technologies that make our lives better? No. I can't sign on to a blanket rejection of all innovation no more than I can sign on to the technological utopianism of Elon Musk. There must be some rational and human middle ground that allows for science, for experimentation, for innovation. Whereas blind reproduction, blind production, and blind consumption are the habits that have to go. Quote, "Finally, we must do away with, far and away, the largest occupation. The one with the longest hours, the lowest pay, and some of the most tedious tasks around. I refer to housewives doing housework and child rearing. By abolishing wage labor and achieving full unemployment, we undermine the sexual divisions of labor. The nuclear family, as we know it, is an inevitable adaptation to the division of labor imposed by modern wage work. Like it or not, as things have become for the last century or two, it is economically rational for the man to bring home the bacon, for the woman to do the shit work, to provide him with a haven in a heartless world, and for the children to be marched off to youth concentration camps called schools, primarily to keep them out of mom's hair, but still under control. incidentally to acquire habits of obedience and punctuality so necessary for workers. If you would be rid of patriarchy, get rid of the nuclear family whose unpaid shadow work, as Ivan Illich says, makes possible the work system that makes it necessary. Bound up in this no-nuke strategy is the abolition of childhood and the closing of the schools. They are more full-time students than full-time workers in this country. We need children as teachers, not students. They have a lot to contribute to the ludic revolution because they're better at playing than grown-ups are. Adults and children are not identical, but they will become equal through interdependence. Only play can bridge the generation gap. Close quote. Looks like good old Mr. Black is going to make me work again. He has passed back into the realm of high theory here. Let's start with the idea of women liberated from traditional domestic roles. Our author may be making an argument built from historical materialism when he says, by abolishing wage labor, we will also do away with the sexual division of labor. Historical materialism is, quote, also known as the materialist conception of history, is a methodology used by scientific socialists and Marxist historiographers to understand human society and their development through history, arguing that historical changes in social structure are the result of material and technological conditions rather than ideals. Close quote. If one were to apply this type of analysis to quote-unquote traditional families, you could argue that as industrial production became dominant and wage labor required one person in a family to spend long hours out of the home, then someone else has to take on all child rearing and homemaking. Indeed, there's a strain of feminist thought that strongly argues for the reinforcing nature of capitalism and patriarchy. As money is a key determinant of power relations in capitalism, then women are further marginalized and dominated as they are at a disadvantage in making and possessing money. Moving to a post-work world where accumulation of wealth wasn't seen as the only objective would free women from some of the oppression that they face now. But this doesn't quite apply to full emancipation, because female roles have been subordinate in Western societies for millennia, and that is supported by tradition, culture, religion, each with roots much earlier than industrial society. Our economic system reinforces dominance, but capitalism isn't the only driver. If I were to imagine a post-work society where, let's say, art became a prized social currency, what keeps that society from still demeaning the art of women, or still insisting that women be more responsible for domestic chores? If Janet is married to a drunk misogynist named Jimmy, I'm not sure her life would be any better if drunk Jimmy were at home all day. I think Bob's onto something, but I don't think it is the full solution. Bob also mentions shadow work, a concept first outlined by Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich, 1926 to 2002, was a Roman Catholic priest, theologian, philosopher, and a very influential social critic. He is best known for criticizing modern schooling in his book Deschooling Society, and modern medicine in his book Medical Nemesis. Shadow work refers to unpaid labor and was first coined by Illich in his 1981 book, the shockingly named Shadow Work. It includes housework, child-rearing, maintenance of social arrangements, self-checkout, self-service at gas stations, etc. It includes work that is unpaid but necessary to make a community or economy function. I'm not completely clear on Bob's argument in this part of the excerpt. Shadow work wouldn't go away in a post-paid labor world. The very definition of the word implies that we would do it regardless. We would still wash clothes, dishes, prepare dinners, parent children, and maintain our homes. You could make an argument that giving everyone in the community heaps of more free time makes all of this work less onerous and easier to distribute. Illich is arguing that shadow work is increasing through self-service, DIY, and other theorists also point to technology, crowdsourcing and social pressure. So change your economy and you might see a corresponding drop in shadow work. But at best, a majority of it would only become a little less horrible. I'm fully on board with his comments about how our society mistreats children and how a post-work society would be better. Imagine if education was about learning for the pleasure of it and not training for a job. Imagine if kids who struggled with traditional education could focus on something they love without being shamed and for being a bad student. Imagine if parents had time to be a positive, engaged presence in their children's lives and were not constantly harangued by society to turn their children into compliant little slaves like the rest of us. It is notable that Bob doesn't return to Illich in these comments, as Illich was one of the most eloquent when criticizing modern quote-unquote education. I say free workers to have a life and free children to have a childhood. Quote, I haven't as yet mentioned the possibility of cutting way down on the little work that remains by automating and cybernizing it. All the scientists and engineers and technicians freed from bothering with war research and planned obsolescence should have a good time devising means to eliminate fatigue and tedium and danger from activities like mining. Undoubtedly, they'll find other projects to amuse themselves with. Perhaps they'll set up worldwide, all-inclusive multimedia communication systems or found space colonies. Perhaps I myself am no gadget freak. I wouldn't care to live in a push-button paradise. I don't want robot slaves to do everything. I want to do things myself. There is, I think, a place for labor-saving technology, but a modest place. The historical and prehistorical record is not encouraging. When productive technology went from hunter-gathering to agriculture and onto industry, work increased, while skills and self-determination diminished. The further evolution of industrialism has accentuated what Harry Braverman called the degradation of work. Intelligent observers have always been aware of this. John Stuart Mill wrote that all labor-saving inventions ever devised haven't saved a moment's labor. Karl Marx wrote that it would be possible to write a history of the inventions made since 1830 for the sole purpose of supplying capital with weapons against the revolts of the working class. The enthusiastic technophiles, Saint-Simon, Comte, Lenin, B.F. Skinner, have always been unabashed authoritarians also, which is to say, technocrats. We should be more than skeptical about the promises of the computer mystics. They work like dogs, chances are, if they had their way, so would the rest of us. But if they have any particularized contributions more readily subordinate to human progress than the run of the high-tech, let's give them a hearing. Close quote. First thing I'm going to say about this excerpt is how prescient it is, given that he is writing in 1985. First, multimedia communications network, internet obviously came true relatively quickly, and the comment about computer mystics working like dogs, certainly prescient about the work environment of Silicon Valley. To repeat myself yet again, 2 years ago I would have been utterly baffled by this passage. I, like most Westerners, was all terribly enamored with technological innovation. This has changed, and I have to thank COVID for giving me the time to slow down and question my assumptions. I'm going to return to Ivan Illich for a moment. Illich, along with E.F. Schumacher and Leopold Kohr, argued strongly against trusting technology. They rightly point out how all the purported labor savings have never translated into less labor, quite the opposite. But more than an outcome-based argument, Illich attacks the whole concept of large, complex tools. His basic complaint in his book, Tools for Conviviality, is that large, complex structures, whether they be computers, robots, factories, or even large organizations, end up enslaving people and reducing our humanity. This is a natural process where the size and complexity requires specialization of skills, large investments of money, resources, and time, and often requires a huge group of people subordinated to a hierarchy of control. Massive projects require groups of people who have to spend years of their life toiling in the service of that complex technical structure. Discipline and sacrifice are hardwired into this complexity. It is impossible to avoid. What is even more concerning is that the size and complexity creates multiple problematic outcomes that we just can't predict. And these outcomes can be correspondingly massive. Look at it this way. If a solar microgrid is damaged, then the small community with a little money and time can fix it. If they can't fix it, only a few people are affected. Now let's compare that to the disasters of Fukushima Daiichi and Chernobyl. Their impact is massive. The crisis in these places remains ongoing for hundreds or thousands of years, and the total cost in money, resources, work hours is enormous. Never mind that these disasters have negatively affected, made homeless, terrified, injured, or killed thousands of otherwise disinterested innocents. Technology is an amazing opportunity, but without clear vision of objectives and cost, it quickly becomes a sword of Damocles dangling above our head. I love technology and benefit from it. After all, I wouldn't be a YouTuber without it. So I am also on board with the small is beautiful theorists here. Small, self-sustaining technology that is widely distributed and built with durability in mind seems a good way forward. Ultimately, unless we are willing to let millions of people die, we have no choice but to keep some technology active in agriculture. As well, I'm all for the time freed up from unnecessary wage labor to be reinvested in scientific education, research, and true innovation. I'm not convinced that the future of humanity is based on some return to an unchanging mass agrarian peasantry for everyone. Although, if that's your jam, then on with you. My final point here. Bob is being conveniently vague in this passage, with good reason. How much technology is a good thing? What is a good technology versus a bad technology? What are we willing to sacrifice to implement a technology? I agree with Bob in general terms, but also believe there is huge potholes in moving this direction. This direction leads to the bright future we see in sustainable communities like Dancing Rabbit in the US, and it can also lead to the dark horrors of Pol Pot's Cambodian killing fields. There are a whole bunch of steps that need to be worked out and tried before we can determine the right mix. Quote, "What I really want to see is work turned into play. A first step is to discard the notions of a job and an occupation. Even activities that already have some ludic content lose most of it by being reduced to jobs which certain people, and only those people, are forced to do to the exclusion of all else. It's not odd that farm workers toil painfully in the fields while their air-conditioned masters go home every weekend to putter about their gardens. Under a system of permanent revelry, we will witness the golden age of the dilettante, which will put the Renaissance to shame. There won't be any more jobs, just things to do and people to do them. The secret of turning work into play, as Charles Fourier demonstrated, is to arrange useful activities to take advantage of whatever it is that various people at various times in fact enjoy doing. To make it possible for some people to do things they could enjoy, it will be enough just to eradicate the irrationalities and distortions which afflict these activities when they are reduced to work. I, for instance, would enjoy doing some, not too much, teaching, but I don't want coerced students and I don't care to suck up to pathetic pedants for tenure." Close quote. Bob, you dirty devil, referencing Charles Fourier. Fourier, 1772 to 1837, was a French philosopher, an early socialist thinker, and one of the founders of utopian socialism. I knew the name and association with utopian socialism, but wasn't familiar with his ideas beyond that. Wikipedia, as usual, was helpful. Fourier's ideal community, quote, had a concern for the sexually rejected, jilted suitors who would be led away by a corpse of fairies who would soon cure them of their lovesickness, and visitors could consult the card index of personality types for suitable partners for casual sex. He also defended homosexuality as a personal preference for some people. Anarchist Hakim Bey describes Fourier's ideas as follows. In Fourier's system of harmony, all creative activity, including our industry, craft, agriculture, etc., will arise from liberated passions. This is the famous theory of attractive labor. Fourier sexualizes work itself. The life of the phalanstery is a continual orgy of intense feeling, intellection, and activity, a society of lovers and wild enthusiasts. Close quote. Okay, maybe with Bob on this one? Sounds absolutely great. Although, do you ever wonder if some of these utopians were just frustrated and horny? Quote, second, there are some things that people like to do from time to time, but not for too long, and certainly not all the time. You might enjoy babysitting for a few hours in order to share the company of kids, but not as much as their parents do. The parents, meanwhile, profoundly appreciate the time to themselves that you free up for them, although they'd get fretful if parted from their progeny for too long. These differences among individuals are what make a life of free play possible. The same principle applies to many other areas of activity, especially the primal ones. Thus, many people enjoy cooking when they can, practice it seriously at their leisure, but not when they're just fueling up human bodies for work. Close quote. I think Bob is referencing a pretty simple and self-evident idea. Who enjoys doing the same thing day after day? Is there anyone who never gets frustrated and bored? Hasn't industrialism and its division of labor made this stultifying situation the continual experience of everyone's daily life? Obviously, we need to give up on the cult of efficiency to implement Bob's recommendations. Dilettantism will inevitably lead to a huge amount of amateur output. But then what is wrong with that? How many home cooks prepare one or two meals superior to the best Michelin star-rated restaurant? How many amateur car mechanics successfully maintain and modify their cars? I use a ton of freeware based on community code writing, and in fact, this script is written with just such an app. It works every bit as well for my purposes as MS Office, only it's free. What he is asking of us? Are you willing to give up $5 t-shirts from Indonesia in order to be free to choose what you do today? That's the trade-off. Consumerism or freedom? There's ample evidence for this approach working in our modern world. I would point to the egalitarian Twin Oaks commune founded in 1967 and still running successfully today. This commune is self-sustaining, producing hammocks and tofu for sale, as well as food for community consumption. It holds all property in common, everyone gets paid the same amount, and everyone chooses how to work and when to work as long as they all contribute a minimum amount of labor per week. It isn't a crazy idea, it's just an idea that hasn't reached mass appeal. Whew. So once again, I have to admit to being tired. Bob, you're very tiring. Yet, I also like where you're going. I like any contrarian who can take some negative criticism of society and turn it into an opportunity for a more free, more equal, and more joyful world. Who, aside from the authoritarian, the fundamentally religious, or the simple mean-spirited, doesn't want what Bob describes? Thanks for joining me yet again in this obsessively deep dive into an obscure screed from decades ago. If you're interested in following along to part 8, which will be the finale of this essay, then please like and subscribe. This is XCG wishing all of you a more joyful traipse down that narrow but meandering path to freedom.